and I'll just give it a time for people to get into the room or more to get into the room. Seems like we've got a pretty good crowd right now. We have 77 people registered for this evening, so you never can tell how many will show up, but still, I think we'll have a good crowd. Good evening, everybody. I'm going to just give a second here before we get started. Thank you so much for coming to our second One Health seminar of the semester. Hopefully all of you who are students, your semester is going well. And then if you're my students who are studying for tomorrow's exam, just take a break, listen to a great presentation, then get back to it. All right, I'm going to get started here. If you're not familiar with One Health, which I think probably most of you who are on this particular Zoom have had some contact with One Health for seminars or in any class that I might have been teaching. But I kind of simplify One Health. Other folks talk about, the connection between literal health between animals and plants and the environment and humans. I'd make it pretty darn simple. We only live on one planet, this planet. We're all on the same planet together. And if any member of this triad of people in society and plants and animals in the environment is not doing well, it's quite likely that it's going to have impacts on the other members of the triad. And we are probably the best at causing damage, but if we put our minds to it, we're also the best at trying to remedy some of the problems that we have in the world, not only at a global level, but at our local level, our regional levels, national, in all of our neighbors around, finding solutions to the many problems that we face. And through my career, one thing that I've learned is, you know what? You get a better solution if you listen to others. There are other people with different experiences, different backgrounds, different disciplines, different majors, and you're going to get a better solution if you bring them into the mix. These can either be multidisciplinary kind of projects or transdisciplinary. I prefer to think in your life anyway, you should be listening to others, that you're going to be, hopefully, a lifelong learner, and that what you'll find, maybe there's a different way of thinking about things than what you've thought before. So at Del Val, we've been doing this for 10 years. We've introduced One Health not only to those folks who are in either veterinary or public health or pre-med, but for the entire campus. If you're in business, this is good for you. No matter what your major is, it's good for you to think outside of just looking at your discipline and approaching problems. It's also good for you to realize that you have a responsibility for this planet as well, and that your actions have implications for you, for your neighbors, for everyone. We approach this from education. We introduce One Health in our Del Val to our first year experience. A number of our courses also engage in addressing One Health within their particular topics. We also encourage student research related to One Health. And I would love to see a bunch of you get together from different majors and come up a really cool project. And I know our student research committee would love to see that too. And then finally, outreach. And that's what tonight is all about. This is outreach. It's not only to everyone on campus, but to our community. Hopefully, there are many of our neighbors and people from way far away who are also joining us this evening to hear this great presentation. And before I get to the introduction, let me remind you, if you haven't paid attention to the flyer, that the presentation you're receiving this evening is based on this fabulous book, Poisoning the Well. And if you go to Island Press, and put in, look for the book. You'll get a discount of 20% using the code POISON. So please do go and get this book. I meant to have a copy with me tonight, but I left it in my office and forgot to bring it because I want to have a chance to. Oh, there's one right behind her. So Sharon's got one right there too. So please, take advantage of this great opportunity. I'm going to stop sharing. And Sharon, if you would like to start bringing up your presentation, I'm going to read uh, your little bio here. So this evening we've got Sharon Udasin is a Colorado-based environmentalist, journalist who has long been delving into complex water contamination and conservation issues. Sharon was a Ted Scripps Fellow in Environmental Journalism at the University of Colorado Boulder in 2019 to 2020 and received a SEAL Environmental Journalism Award in 2023. A graduate of both the University of Pennsylvania, somewhere close by, and Columbia Journalism School, she has reported for numerous publications over the past 2 decades, including The Hill, MSNBC, the Jerusalem Post, the Colorado Sun, National Geographic News, and the New York Jewish Week. We are so pleased to have you with us this evening, and thank you so much for bringing this important topic to all of our guests here tonight.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. And if my voice is hoarse at all throughout, I have the end of COVID right now, so I have my cup of tea to get me through that. Also, I am from New Jersey, so I'm from your sort of area. I mean, actually, part of New Jersey is in the Delaware Valley, but not my part. I'm from East Brunswick near Rutgers University. But I will just dive right into the presentation. So when we head to the grocery store, treat ourselves to new clothes, or refill our water bottles, most of us aren't really aware of every ingredient we're about to encounter. Instead, we're putting our trust in companies and governments to keep us safe in sort of an unwritten pact between supplier and consumer. But today we're going to take a look at cases in which that trust has been broken, focusing on communities that have weathered some of the most tragic effects of what has now become a global contamination crisis. So we'll start with a brief visit to a place called Cortland, Alabama, to encounter one of these places. There it is. And here is the historic Cortland downtown square, which I had the privilege of visiting in March 2023. When I was in Cortland, I saw a historic southern town that was surrounded by really beautiful, sprawling greenery, farms everywhere, a place that was home to one of the South's first railroads. And also a place that has nearly 200 years of architecture, which ranged from the Victorian era to white picket fence veranda wrapped cottages. But what I also saw there was a huge amount of death and devastation. Let's now hear from Brenda Hampton, an activist who took me on a ride through Cortland in March 2023. And in this photo, which was taken at that time, I am sitting in the passenger seat right here, and she was saying the following at approximately this time.
The father and the mother, the father and the son had died there. The next house, the mother died at. The next house coming down the street, husband and wife died. The next house was husband and wife. The next house was a female that died. Young girl died here in this house here. To service this house, the husband died in there. He had renal failure. The wife is still alive in there. The lady that lived in there, she's dead.
So my co-author and I came to call this Brenda's death tour, and she took each of us on this separately down the streets of her town. Now, the thing about Brenda is that she's just a regular person, like any of us, who in 2015 was undergoing a routine checkup as part of her managerial transfer for McDonald's from Boston to Tennessee. Shockingly, though, during that physical, she learned that she was in renal failure and kidney failure and that she had been exposed to something toxic. And what she said to me was what I was working with. It was nothing toxic, hamburgers and French fries. well, maybe toxic in other ways, but not in PFAS ways. But she was so startled that she decided to move back to her hometown where her daughters lived, and that hometown was Cortland, Alabama. And just so you see what this looks like here in this map, we have Cortland, and then right above it, there's North Cortland. These are the twin Cortlands, and each of them have, just a few hundred people each. Now, Brenda is an extremely curious person, and she very quickly observed just how sick people were in both of the Cortlands. She found 54 cases of cancer and 14 of kidney failure in 2 streets alone. Now, how could this be? Residents were just trusting the tap, which is something that each of us do daily. Well, Cortland residents eventually found out that their water was contaminated by compounds known as PFAS. Now, Brenda, once she understood that no one was coming to their rescue, she ended up self-funding efforts to distribute supplies and drive neighbors to medical appointments. But as you might guess, she was not spared herself. In addition to her renal failure, she has suffered 2 heart attacks and a stroke. But let's go back a little bit and try to understand, what are PFAS exactly? Well, they are per and polyfluoral alkyl substances. But really, that's an acronym for about 15,000 synthetic organofluorines. They're in many household items, such as waterproof fabrics, nonstick pans, and cosmetics, as well as certain firefighting foams. And I would venture a guess that every single person that is listening to this presentation right now, and even me, probably has something on their bodies that has PFAS in it right now, as much as you may have tried to avoid it. And that's because the water and stain resistant properties have made these compounds so useful in things, also like things that are critical, like medical devices, heart valves, first responder gear, and things like semiconductors. So, what's the actual problem with PFAS? Well, they don't break down in the environment virtually at all, and they linger in the human body by binding to proteins in the blood of at least 97% of Americans, and that's according to the CDC. They're linked to many cancers, kidney, thyroid, heart, reproductive, and immunological issues. And downstream from massive industrial discharges, the effects can be dire, something that became readily apparent in Brenda Hampton's neighborhood. We'll get back into that a bit more later. With such risky effects, you might think that regulators were quick to step in, but the EPA took decades to regulate just a few PFAS. They're forever and they're everywhere. And before we dive into the truly pervasive nature of PFAS, here's a quick rundown of what we're about to cover today, starting with the birth of these chemicals. So PFAS may be forever and everywhere, but they weren't always. In fact, their birth was entirely accidental, and it basically happened in your general neighborhood. And that was when postdoctoral scholar Roy Plunkett was working on alternatives for hazardous refrigerants at a New Jersey DuPont lab in 1938. What was that lab? It was called Deepwater. So very close to. And this meant for him that he was storing very, very cold cylinders of tetrafluoroethylene, TFE gas. And he assumed that that gas would remain a gas. But when he opened the cylinders, Roy found a mysterious white powder. What had happened? Well, upon further research, he understood that the TFE had undergone polymerization, in which a carbon-carbon double bond in a TFE breaks apart and attacks others. The powder that formed as a result was heat resistant, and most things didn't stick to it. DuPont, his company, saw the potential value in those properties and decided to trademark the substance as poly-TFE, or PTFE, or as we all know it now, Teflon in 1944. Now, Teflon very quickly appealed to the US military. It was resistant to heat and corrosion, and it didn't interact with other chemicals. So one of its first uses was to contain highly reactive materials like uranium in the making of the atom bomb. Now, Teflon only reached consumers thanks to an inventor across the world in a village called Rumilly, France. So in Rumilly, French inventor Marc Gregoire began coating his own pans in his kitchen after his wife challenged him to do so. She had seen him doing so with his fishing rods. And after they saw how great that was, he decided to launch the company Tefal in 1956. Tefal then began exporting its products to the US in 1961 and was highly popularized after Jackie Kennedy was randomly photographed purchasing a pan. So now that we're back in the 60s era, let's look at a quick commercial for Teflon.
Ladies, no more scraping, no more grinding, no more pounding, no more scouring, no more problems, no more mess with new Slip Away. You just spray, bake, and slip away. Yes, here in this handy spray can is new Slip Away, the revolutionary new non-stick coating for pots, pans, ovens, and grills. And Slip Away contains the magic of DuPont Teflon. Just spray the surface of your cooking utensils, bake in the oven for 30 minutes, and your Slip Away non-stick surface will literally last for months.
Ladies. Um, so not everything was really as shiny as these pans, because beneath the surface, what was happening was that there was toxicological research going on at many of the companies that were actually marketing the products. So, as early as the 1950s, researchers inside and outside of DuPont found that some people exposed to heated Teflon were developing flu-like effects. That was called polymer fume fever. In 1959, an FDA official wrote that Teflon may be unstable under cooking temperatures, and some decomposition products are quite toxic. And yet, that same FDA went on to approve Teflon-coated cookware. In 1961, a DuPont toxicologist warned that some PFAS could cause liver enlargement in rats. By 1978, another company that was a PFAS producer, 3M, found the compounds in the blood of its employees with fluorine levels proportional to the length of time they worked there and persisting in some individuals for 15 to 20 years after. And in 1981, 3M identified something so problematic about one type of PFAS called PFOA that it decided it needed to alert the EPA. And that was a link to birth defects in rats. Basically, fetuses of rats that had consumed PFOA were developing eye deformities. But the same alert that they issued to the EPA also emphasized that, quote, no human health problems have been observed. So, one of the places where 3M and other industries set up shop was in northern Alabama, near the city of Decatur and upstream from Brenda's community of Cortland. So, there we have Cortland. There is the 3M facility established in 1961. There's the city of Decatur. So, basically, this is referred to as the Decatur 3M. And there's the direction of the river. So, Cortland is downstream from this facility. Now, locally, by 1976, 3M identified another notorious type of PFAS, PFOS, in the blood of a Decatur worker. And then, sorry, again in several employees in 1979. By the 1990s, 3M scientists were citing possible interests in health risks to workers, things like liver and bladder cancers, as well as endocrine and reproductive disorders. Now, the effects were also stretching beyond the factory bounds. In 1979, PFAS were found in fish that were caught in the river around Wheeler Dam and water utilities downstream from the plant. And I included this picture here, which I took when I was there in March 2023. This is Wheeler Dam, the expansive dam across the Tennessee River. And here to this day, this is a very contaminated area. And you'll see maybe a couple signs here and there that warn about fishing. But you also see copious numbers of fisher people getting fish for their families despite that contamination. Now, by 2007, the federal government started to step in, and the regional branch of the EPA began testing the water in this river after one company reported that it had, quote, unknowingly discharged large amounts of PFAS. And then in 2014, the CDC's Toxic Registry Agency, the ATSDR, was taking community blood samples and found that PFOA and PFOS levels there were 2 to 4 times higher than US averages. Now, many plants still line the Tennessee River today, and they're actually allowed to dump there, according to Alabama law, even though the EPA deems the area impaired with PFOS and with agricultural materials. Companies have at times violated their legal bounds, doing things like underreporting PFAS releases and breaching contracts. But it's important to remember that these plants are a pillar in the Decatur region and a major employer for local families. And one of the previous city council members, she was actually a city council president, and she has a pretty major role in the book. She put it this way. She says here, look at Decatur's history. Anything and everything we have. If it's to the hospital benefit or anybody, you look on the program, who is the platinum giver? 3M. And Brenda Hampton, whom we met earlier, also had something interesting to say about this, about the lack of regulation that really applies to Alabama. They are still taking advantage of Alabama. Nobody goes by any rules. Nobody questions anything, except, of course, Brenda herself. And she actually ended up recruiting a small cohort of fellow activists as well as scientists to her side. They've pushed through lawsuits, tested water, exposed injustices in the media. But remember how I said these industries are a pillar in the community. So the economy really depends on them. And Brenda has therefore made herself an enemy of many locals who rely on that industry. And she said she was shot at, had 2 cars destroyed, and found that someone broke into her truck and left a cut up Chucky doll. But her efforts did help secure a settlement between 3M and her water utility. That was for $35 million in 2019. And this enabled the distribution of small checks to affected residents and also allowed the utility to build a reverse osmosis treatment plant, meaning that Brenda and her neighbors now have PFAS-free water flowing through their taps. And there's the facility. And this was just the first of multiple settlements between 3M and Decatur area residents. The others appear in very meticulous detail in the book. And if you like a good small town municipal corruption fight, then those chapters are for you. But for now, we can appreciate how the experiences I've really summarized here about Cortland and Decatur show the impacts of PFAS producers on adjacent communities. But it's important to remember that at the same time, industry is not alone. The military has really been part of this journey since day one. And I'm going to take you to Colorado, where I'm sitting right now. Well, actually, two hours south of where I'm sitting right now, to see an example. So I am in Boulder, and that is Colorado Springs. Actually, El Paso County, Colorado, not Texas. Colorado Springs and the surrounding areas are really known for their natural wonders that they have. It's particularly Garden of the Gods, which is this park filled with massive red rock formations. But these areas are also home to several military installations. There are about 5, but 3 of the most known ones are Peterson Space Force Base, the U.S. Air Force Academy, and the U.S. Army's Fort Carson. All in all, about 45,000 military personnel, 15,000 federal workers, and 90,000 veterans reside in this region. So just to get a lay of the land, here we have Peterson Space Force Base. There's Fort Carson, the Army base. And this is the area of focus in terms of contamination. Strathmore is a neighborhood of actual Colorado Springs, but it was not attached to the municipal water supply system for a long time. And Security and Widefield are suburbs of Colorado Springs. So as we learned earlier, PFAS from a military perspective, had early roots in World War II in the making of the atom bomb, but its military usage really took off in the 1960s because that was when the Navy was working with 3M to develop AFFF, which is a foam capable of suppressing really catastrophic jet fuel-based fires. By 1979, AFFF was present at more than 90 U.S. civilian airports, and hundreds of military sites were using the foam in emergencies and in training drills. Now, just like industry, reports show that the military was really looking into the potential toxicity of these substances for decades. And there are so many examples throughout the relevant chapters in the book, but I'll give you a few of them here. In 1971, there was a report citing a threat to fish, calling AFFF a serious pollutant, and said that it didn't break down. 1985, a report at Peterson labeled AFFF as hazardous. 2016, the Army Corps of Engineers identified PFAS on base at Peterson and cited potential non-carcinogenic risks to human health and the environment, as well as the migration of PFAS to down gradient wells. Now, interestingly, Fort Carson, the Army base, started using water for training purposes in 1993. So it started listening to the military's own advice and replaced AFFF entirely in 2018. Now, Peterson took much longer. Remember, this is just up the road. This is about a 15-minute drive. And it's really difficult to get an answer as to why exactly this other base up the road took so much longer. But one theory that has been raised with me was that the Air Force simply has more planes, and jet fuel-based fires are just incredibly catastrophic. Like, jet fuel is so flammable at these temperatures. And just so you see an image of how it was used on base, to the left, I took these photos in May 2023. To the left, we have the fire equipment, the truck, and to the right, you'll see a charred plane sitting in the middle of the field between the fence and the snow-capped mountains. And that was an old plane. What they would do in exercises is just light it on fire, and then the firefighters would come and train with the foam, and then that foam would leach right into the environment. Now, the FAA was also requiring its firefighters to test and train with AFFF until 2019. So it wasn't just the military, but also civilian aviation. And oftentimes, that AFFF as well was flowing into the environment if it wasn't properly contained. Now, the Department of Defense banned AFFF for use in training in fiscal year 2020, and then pledged to cease its use entirely by 2024. This has largely occurred from what I gather, but as we'll revisit later, Congress also recently approved its use again. So there's a lot of question marks surrounding AFFF at this moment. But bringing us back to Peterson in 2021, this was some nice news out of there. The Air Force Civil Engineering Unit actually launched some PFAS removal pilot programs at Peterson, basically opening up certain areas to university labs that want to test out technologies to remove or degrade PFAS. But as of 2023, the Air Force had spent a total of more than $103 million on PFAS response at Peterson alone. And there are more than 500 bases across America that require some PFAS remediation. So you can imagine just how many tax dollars we are now spending to clean up our own mess. And I'd like you to meet another protagonist from the book who's from this part of the story, and his name is Mark Favors. He grew up next to these bases during the Cold War era, part of a tightly knit Black family in largely white Colorado Springs. And as he tells it, that Cold War era patriotism kind of molded Colorado Springs into a libertarian stronghold in which small government ideology reigned supreme and politics were really highly discouraged. Military service, on the other hand, was all but compulsory, and that includes for Mark and members of his family. So today he's an ICU nurse in New York City, but again, he himself is a veteran, as are so many of his relatives. Now, Mark only randomly learned what PFAS was in 2018 while he was visiting his mom in Colorado Springs, and they were watching a TV special. But it turns out that since 1991, Mark had been seeking answers for the untimely death of his paternal grandmother, Arletha Bragg. And you'll see in this photo, Arletha is to the left, and his maternal aunt, Ivory, is to the right. So paternal, maternal, no genetic relation, but both of these two actually lived in very similar areas and ended up dying early of cancers. And luckily, Colorado actually has a really robust and accessible PFAS sampling system that the public can readily view. And so Mark was able to do some research and understand that PFAS levels near Arletha's house in Widefield were far, far, far above EPA advisories. Now, illness has really just abounded in this family. Mark's cousin Princess, who appears on this mural, she's no longer alive. She grew up in Stratmore Valley, which is that southern neighborhood of Colorado Springs that was not connected to the supply. She had lupus-related kidney damage already at age 16 and then developed bladder cancer. Her brother, veteran Steve Patterson, who's also Mark's cousin, of course, he actually was a match for his sister and he was able to give her a kidney. However, the cancer returned to her liver, kidney, spine, anus, and brain, and she ultimately died about 13 years ago, I believe. And Steve also he had early onset prostate cancer and then later on developed rectal cancers. He, however, is doing okay at the moment. I just wanted you to hear a particularly poignant comment from Steve about how this family really deals with all this tragedy.
We're happy, we hang together, we laugh, we have fun, even though we just lost a brother, they just lost a cousin. But life goes on. I mean, cry at the funeral, but sometimes we don't even cry because I don't think we have any more tears left because it's just been so many deaths. It's just been too many.
So, all in all, Mark estimates that more than 2 dozen of his family members have suffered from serious illnesses he attributes to PFAS releases from these spaces. And again, these are not all related to each other. There are step cousins, in-laws, like really people from various different actual blood families that have contracted these illnesses, and at least 5 family members have suffered from kidney-related diseases in particular. Now, Mark, he hasn't kept quiet about these issues, and since 2019, he's really trying to fight it on a national level. In November of that year, at a House hearing, he testified about his family and urged Congress to launch an investigation into the PFAS issue. At the time, he spoke alongside Mark Ruffalo, the actor who portrayed lawyer Rob Blat's fight against DuPont in West Virginia in the film Dark Waters. And at the time, they were seemed to be making pretty bipartisan progress on the at least in the discussion of an idea of a potential investigation. As probably would be expected, the Democratic contingent supported this idea, but also too did the Republicans. And Representative James Comer, a Republican from Kentucky, said that while he opposed sweeping actions that could cause economic harm, he supported compensating families, quote, poisoned intentionally by corporate America. And you can read that in the testimony. But unfortunately, you'll also notice the timeline here, the November 2019. That was really not a good time to be starting something new because a global pandemic hit less than 2 months later. But Mark hasn't stopped, and he continues to testify in Congress as recently as about 6 months ago, and he's pushing and pushing and pushing this issue as much as he can and whenever he can. And ultimately, his goals are to find out what really happened and hold people accountable if there was something nefarious, as the documents imply. So hold them accountable where? In court? Well, that's complicated, and that's due to the lack of legal recourse people have, as well as inconsistencies among states. One of the biggest inconsistency is something called a statute of limitations. Those are laws that define the amount of time people have to sue for something. So just to give you some examples, in Colorado, since that's what we're talking about right now, they have a strict 2-year statute of limitations, but victims can wait to sue until they find a clear cause for their injury. In Alabama, however, victims can only sue within 2 years of becoming ill, like no matter what the cause. So virtually impossible for them. Now, some of Mark's relatives have joined a multi-district litigation called an MDL also, and that has grouped thousands of claims versus AFFF producers before a federal judge in South Carolina. But notice that says AFFF producers because suing the military is very, very hard due to the federal government's discretionary function immunity shield, which really holds up, except in very, very extreme scenarios. Therefore, Mark is calling for an independent congressional investigation into the issue. However, he repeatedly says to me that there isn't really a sum of money that could make up for his family's losses, and how he puts it is there's not enough money in the U.S. Treasury for my grandmother. So we've seen really how entire families, entire neighborhoods have faced devastating consequences from PFAS pollution, whether from military or industrial sources. But because these chemicals also impact plants and animals, they've had dramatic effects on farms nationwide as well. So let's go to the East Coast, to Maine, so not quite in your area, to see an example. So in the book, we have a pretty long section on both central and southern Maine, but right now we're just going to stop in southern Maine in the town of Arundel. And there we meet Fred Stone. Fred is a really dedicated dairy farmer. His cows are members of his family. His license plate is Dairy O, and he's well versed in diseases of cattle, revised edition from 1918, I believe. He has, stacks of these books in his garage, like really quirky human being, and really interesting. Now, Fred, his farm has long been his family. His grandfather, it was an 18th century farm that his grandfather purchased in 1914 after coming home from serving in World War One. And then after it went through a couple generations, Fred and his wife Laura bought it from Fred's parents in 1977. But for Fred, there's a clear date of doom in his life, and that was November 3rd, 2016, when he received a letter from his water district saying that something called PFAS in his Wells aquifer were double the EPA's advisories. After realizing that the cows were drinking this water, the Stones took it upon themselves to test their milk, and that came back with sky-high PFAS levels. So Stone Ridge Farm was then immediately suspended from shipping milk. Fred remembers how before state officials became familiar with PFAS, they didn't know what it was either, not just him. An inspector came around and suggested that he exterminate his herd as if his cows had an infectious disease. And this is what Fred had to say about that.
All that I knew. I said, we'll go down to the compost site because we have a thing for, exterminating animals. And I said, and again, these cow families go way back to, 40, 50 years and generations and generations and lineage in my head. So I said, I'll tell you what, Tanya, I said, I'll do that. We'll take them all down there. I'll put on my show white and I'll stand in front and I'll take the first bullet and then you can slaughter the rest of them. A week later, I get a letter from the state of Maine about suicide prevention.
He's not kidding. All of that is true and a real testament to his character. But the Stones decided to switch their cows to a clean feed in January 2017 and then paid to install a $23,000 water filtration system in May of that same year. Now, after about 18 months, the milk the cows were producing was PFAS free and they were able to start shipping again. Until, lo and behold, samples started showing PFAS again. What happened? It turns out that one new feed product that they ended up using came from locally sourced corn, which was also contaminated. So the Stones lost their milk license for the second time in spring 2019. Now, in June 2017, Maine's Department of Environmental Protection figured out what the cause was, and that was the 1983 to 2004 spread of something called sludge. So, what is sludge? Those are the semi-solids left over after sewage treatment. And in Maine, much of that comes from treatment lagoons on site at paper mills. There are many, many paper mills across Maine. Sorry. And many of them have used PFAS in their pulping processes. The water treatment that occurs there, it removes solids, but not PFAS. Some of the PFAS sticks to the solids and some stays in the water. But who conducted the spreading of the sludge in this case? Well, it was actually none other than Fred Stone himself. At Maine's bidding, he had slathered fields, his own and fields of others, he was paid to do it, with what he thought was nutritious fertilizer. What had happened was utilities were peddling sludge to farmers as a win-win. They didn't need to pay for landfilling, and farmers got free fertilizer. This all occurred with the support of the state of Maine, which was struggling with dump space shortage, and that was due to a 1989 ban on building new private landfilling sites. So during yet another environmental inspection, Fred was equipped with choice words and decades-old documents. This one is a permit from the 1980s, allowing him to spread this sludge and guaranteeing that doing so will not pollute any water at the state of Maine. And here it has the Department of Environment's signature. And then he also included this document here, which is from 2016 and shows us the high PFAS levels in the aquifer there. And here's what he had to say about that.
And because I am a complete a-hole, I walked over to my filing cabinet and pulled out a permit from '86, and it is on Department of Environmental Protection's masthead. It states this material will not contaminate any waters of the state of Maine. This material will not present a health hazard. There's a whole laundry list goes through. And on the backside, it is signed by the commissioner at the time of DEP. And just because I'm really go for gold, I also included the letter from Kmart Water stating that the water in the aquifers in 146 was contaminated. And game, set, and match. I'm positive that the poor girl from DEP did not know that those documents existed.
So Fred Stone is what we call an accidental activist. He emphasizes that he's not an organic farmer, they're conventional. He says, we do not fit the mold of what you'd call an environmentalist. And yet to Fred, fixing this problem has never been about labels. He said, I quote, it doesn't matter whether you're Republican or Democrat, what you are. It's very hard to vote against public health and food safety. So he's a Republican, and he joined hands with a local legislator, a Democrat named Henry Ingwerson, and together they've advanced numerous bipartisan PFAS bills, making this state that was really like responsible for a lot of its own pollution now one of the most advanced states in terms of PFAS legislation, with things like the first complete ban on PFAS in consumer products, which will take full effect by 2030. The state has one of the only bans on PFAS sludge application to land now. And there's a $60 million PFAS fund for buybacks of polluted farmland. But like, this has been a really personal struggle as well for the Stones. They had to file for Chapter 12 bankruptcy on their own house. They needed food stamps and also subsidized health care. But recently, much after the publication of this book, actually, Fred got some good news, and they are going to be partnering with a solar energy company to now put solar panels on their contaminated land. So that's some good news for them. So we've had a look at how local communities and states have both created and coped with the threats posed by PFAS. But before concluding, let's take a broader look how the federal government is faring and how your region is faring, and then end with some potential solutions. So the book goes back, I believe, to the George W. Bush era, but I'm going to just start with Obama at this point, in which PFAS was not a priority at all. Some research did occur, however. The EPA updated its 1976 toxics law. Chemicals would now need to be proven innocent to enter the market rather than guilty to be removed. And in 2012, the EPA started identifying more types of PFAS, for example, Gen X in North Carolina's Cape Fear River and in other places. And in that particular place, one interesting thing was that they found Gen X, and then blood tests that were follow-ups later showed three even newer types of PFAS. So that's why I put this whack-a-mole image here, and we called the chapter that related to this whack-a-mole because it was just like every time you get rid of a PFAS, a new one just pops up. And the same thing was happening during this period with DuPont itself and its PFAS businesses. Like it kept spinning off all the PFAS businesses, they kept trading hands. And when you ask DuPont about this, they say in 2019, DuPont de Nemours was established as a new multi-industrial specialty products company. DuPont de Nemours has never manufactured or sold PFOA, PFAS, Gen X, or firefighting foam. So now, once you get to Trump 1.0, you have an era in which they were assessing the need for drinking water regulations but didn't set them. One staffer talked about writing a hazardous substance rule for PFOA and PFOS, and he remembered that it was like waiting for Godot because it just sat there. New PFAS were approved via a loophole that allows looser review for chemicals made in small quantities. And this EPA also created another loophole to weaken toxic release reporting, a loophole that then the Biden EPA ended up closing. Now, a pivotal moment arrived for PFAS in April 2024, and this is when the EPA finally set, this is the Biden EPA now, set the country's first federal drinking waters for PFAS. And this was for 6 types of PFAS, 6 out of about 15,000. Yeah, but you should kind of see this 4 ppt on the chart here, something worth remembering, 4 parts per trillion. Those are the final MCLs, the maximum contaminant limit for PFOA and PFOS. And just as a frame of reference, 1 part per trillion is equivalent to about a couple drops of water in 20 Olympic size pools. So we're talking about really, really minuscule quantities that are considered the limit in drinking water. And public systems would need to monitor for these 6 types of PFAS and fix all issues by 2029. And Biden's EPA also designated PFOA and PFOS as hazardous under CERCLA, or also called Superfund Cleanup Law, and this made it easier to force polluters to clean up or pay for contamination. Unlike PFAS, not everything is forever, and we got to Trump 2.0, in which we have quite a mixed bag for PFAS. Lot of uncertainty. So in May 2025, so less than a year ago, the EPA announced that it would be rescinding and reconsidering limits on 4 of the 6 types of PFAS in spring 2026, so this spring, and they would keep the regulations on PFOA and PFOS, but they would extend compliance to 2031. So technically give like public water utilities 2 more years to have these known carcinogens in their water system. May 2025 as well, the EPA postponed certain reporting deadlines for producers. But on the other hand, in September 2025, the EPA decided to maintain the Biden administration's hazardous substance designations for PFAS and PFOA. So again, really mixed. In November 2025, the EPA approved 2 single fluorinated pesticides. I will not even try to pronounce them. And this is debated whether the pesticides themselves are PFAS. They break down into TFA, which scientists usually deem PFAS, but they are not officially identified as such in the US or the EU. In December 2025, the fiscal year 2026 National Defense Authorization Act became law, and I mentioned this earlier that we were going to revisit something with AFFF. So this law has now deemed that the military can purchase AFFF till 2026 instead of 2024. But most of the bases have already gotten rid of it because they pledged to do so. So it's really unclear what's going to come of this because now suddenly they're allowed to purchase it again, but I'm not sure if they will. And 2026 is only, it's, a quarter of the way over almost already. I don't know. It's really a really big unknown here. There are other things, vague things in there about the acceleration of PFAS cleanup and technology. A bit confusing. And then in February, the EPA posted its 1 year PFAS actions highlights, including like the launch of PFAS Outreach Initiative, which is to connect with every public water system that needs system upgrades. But let's see where Pennsylvania stands, since that's where Delaware Valley University is, even if the valley spreads through 3 states. I think I got that right. In 2019, the state legislature created a remediation fund for utilities impacted by PFAS from military bases. A 2023 regulation set limits on PFOS and PFOA. Those are obviously higher than the federal limits, but if the federal ones were ever to disappear entirely, then at least Pennsylvania does have some sort of standard. Not all states do. As far as laws, there's a lot of proposals, but not much actual legislation that has gone through. But bills proposed in 2025 or this year, reporting requirements for oil and gas operators, which would have detailed information about chemicals used in hydraulic fracturing, and indicating that in fracking you cannot use PFAS. Another proposed bill would involve the ban on the sale, manufacture, and distribution of PFAS-laden firefighting foam. That's the AFFF, and warning labels about PFAS content in firefighting gear. A ban on the sale, manufacture, and distribution of PFAS-laden gear. Another bill proposed banned on PFAS in juvenile items, menstrual products, dental floss, cosmetics. And I'll just say a lot of states have these already, and these are just proposals in Pennsylvania. And testing requirements for PFAS in public water systems. Another proposal is a provision for the Department of Environmental Protection to study PFAS in biosolids. So that's the sludge I mentioned earlier in Maine. And unfortunately, in Pennsylvania, private well owners are responsible for their own testing, PFAS testing and treatment. That's not provided by the state, as far as I could find. So to dive specifically into the Delaware Valley, yes, I did get that right. Is it 3 states or 4? Oh wait, 4. So I'm going to pull up this EWG map. That's the Environmental Working Group. And I kind of did a snapshot of this area to show where the light blue is like areas where drinking water is above proposed limits for PFAS. Then the purple military sites, orange other known sites. Obviously, I'm not going to get through everything, but we have the Horsham, Warminster, sorry if I'm saying any of these wrong, Warrington Military Contamination Zones. Pennsylvania Department of Health in late 2018 found elevated levels in the blood of residents of these communities. And despite the installation of filtration systems in many of these public utilities, some PFAS are still slipping through, depending on the location, because this is just so contaminated. Interestingly, recently, the Horsham Land Redevelopment Authority recently announced revitalization plans for that area. And there was a 2025 study that found PFAS in the blood of most Montgomery and Bucks County adults who were tested. Also, North Wales Water Authority, in their 2024 water quality report, shows elevated PFAS presence. Um, the Delaware River Basin Commission in 2025 tested 10 stem sites that range from Trenton in New Jersey to Chester in Delaware. And PFAS was found in all 17 and all 8 fish samples that had been taken, and 15 out of 17 sediment samples. So this is pretty hotspot region. And other regional sites that have been particularly problematic include Paulsboro and Deepwater, New Jersey for industrial manufacturing, as well as Newcastle, Delaware for military, among actually many other places. The good news, however, in general, is that there is an ability to remove PFAS from drinking water, and the three main technologies are granular activated carbon, in which a sponge-like carbon-based material traps PFAS in its pores as water rushes through. But this is less effective for tinier or newer types of PFAS called ultra short chains, and they can kind of slip through this sometimes. And also, um, I believe that the Pennsylvania ones that I said before, I believe that they use this GAC, and I think that some can get just oversaturated when the PFAS levels are just way too high. Reverse osmosis is a type of semi-permeable membrane that basically prevents PFAS and other contaminants from passing through. It's very expensive and very consumes a lot of water. And ion exchange is another interesting one that they use out here in the West a lot because it just consumes a lot less water. But in this ion exchange mechanism, I won't go through it entirely. You leave behind like an inert, a harmless salt and a PFAS-laden resin, basically. But that serves to tell you that while these technologies remove PFAS, they don't destroy them. Instead, the chemicals become someone else's forever problem. And that's because it's so hard to crack the formidable carbon fluorine bond, um, which I could explain later if I had more time. Um, but scientists in labs around the world are innovating techniques for actually breaking that bond. And some of their technologies are market ready at this moment. Essentially, they are breaking what I just called unbreakable. And the three main categories of these technologies are called electrochemical oxidation, low temperature plasma treatment, and sonolysis. And again, not going to go into detail about them right now, but plenty of information about them in the book, or you can Google them. But just an example here, there's a tool called the PFAS Annihilator by Revive Environmental of the Patel Memorial Institute, in which a reaction occurs in supercritical water that is neither liquid nor gas, but has the properties of both under high temperature and pressure. And gases that don't dissolve in water now can, creating a super solvent fluid that is expandable and compressible and allows reactions to occur with fewer limits. So oxidants like air or hydrogen peroxide can catalyze that formidable carbon fluorine breakdown. And what's left is PFAS-free water, carbon dioxide, and inert salts. And in this case, like several container size annihilators are up and running. And if PFAS arrives in concentrate, they're able to treat the equivalent of 500,000 gallons of effluent daily. Some other PFAS breakdown startups, there are really many, many more, but, and that's good news, is Aquaga's HALT technology. There's a Swiss one called Oxyle, and there's a Clarity, which also has a mobile trailer system. Now, these companies might all have different methods of solving the problem, but again, the core of the issue is the same, and that's breaking down the carbon fluorine bond and just how hard that is to do. So we'll end with a quote from the CEO of Revive, who really describes that effort in a fitting way. What he says is, "This is like The Rock and John Cena holding hands, and you're trying to break that." So that is poisoning the well. That is my email below, sharon.udasin@gmail.com. I don't know how much time we have for questions, if any, but I'm happy to take them. And that is your code again at the bottom.
Great presentation. Thank you so much, Sharon.
Thank you.
Folks, we haven't got a lot of time, but we got a couple of minutes anyway. If you do have questions, please put those into Q&A at the well, probably at the bottom of your screen. Depends on where it shows up on your screen. I got to say, Sharon, you've touched me in many locations. Certainly, that PA location touches every single Delaware Valley University student. Uh, the area you're talking about is just a little bit south of us. Probably most of us travel through it on a good part of our time. In addition, I grew up about 10 miles from Arundel, Maine. So,
Wow.
and a number of dairy farms around there. And I think I know the one that you're talking about. So we do have a question from Anonymous. While not explicitly covered in this talk, I noticed racial patterns in company development and PFAS use. Is that something you looked into when you were writing the book?
Yes, and actually the first two protagonists that I presented here, they discuss it a lot in the book as well, and it's kind of like, not just racial but socioeconomic. And if you look at Brenda's community, well, unfortunately, a lot of times that comes hand in hand, that that sort of discrimination. And in Brenda's community, um, they basically were thought of as just, this like afterthought, the sacrifice community, whom the companies like were employing them or still are actually. Like there's many there. And the people have grown dependent on the companies for employment, and it's just this vicious cycle. And yeah, that's a pattern that's unfortunately repeating itself, and not just with PFAS, across a lot of environmental justice issues. But yes, in the book we do definitely cover that.
We have another question from Nicholas. Hi, Nicholas. Good to see you, or not see you, but to hear from you anyway. I'm afraid I will have to leave this webinar early. I have a municipal commissioners meeting. I need to seek answers to a neighborhood that has suffered a massive fuel spill. Please, oh, so he just wants us to say thank you to you. And I would appreciate, yeah, a copy of the slides. Actually, the video will be posted by tomorrow, so you should be able to get this, Nicholas. It should be good.
Yeah.
And it's a major issue in our area, Nicholas. We got some other, boy, we've got a bunch of other questions.
Yeah, I
So,
see that.
Christian, what filters be a good way to help prevent getting microplastics or PFAS into our systems even more?
Well, so I'm just covering PFAS here, but I mean there are plenty of home filtration systems. The three technologies that I listed before, there are, well, not for all three, but there are home versions for some of these as well, if that's what the question is. There are reverse osmosis systems for homes, both for full house and for just under kitchen sink. Because under, if you want to have just under kitchen sink, that's probably more affordable than revamping your entire plumbing system. Same thing with granular activated carbon. So yeah, there are solutions, but like they can be expensive and not affordable to everyone.
Stephen, so what do you believe is the cause of the toxicity when PFAS is non-reactive?
Well, a lot of it is about how it mimics proteins in your blood, is from what I understand, and it kind of causes all these endocrine disruptions. But I'm not, I've written about this. I would probably defer to toxicologists to get into much more detail, but it's about how they bind to the proteins in your blood. But yes, they are, that is true that they're not reactive. They're very stable, and that is like part of the problem with the carbon fluorine bond, is that it's just so stable, and that um it's really something that is so difficult to crack. But that was also part of its advantage. Like I feel like we're forgetting that now. And I mean, I'm not advocating for PFAS, but like many technologies that are invented, like this had and still has uses, really, and sometimes really critical uses. So it's easy now to say, to speak in hindsight, um, but yeah, I don't I don't know what else is going to be poisoning us down the line either.
Sharon, I've got a question related to Teflon. And
Mhm.
so certainly you might tell that I am older. And certainly for a good portion of my life, I've been in contact with Teflon coated cookware. And are there any studies that are looking specifically, other than water contamination, about people who have had any issues from the cookware itself?
So, from what I understand, I think that the cookware, it's when it gets like scratched, that then the Teflon can get into your food and then into your system. And I think that's where studies have more focused. I mean, the most research has occurred with uh, the biggest body of work is with ingestion through water.
Right.
But there is through food as well. And there have been, I see there's also a question here about fish. There have been a lot of studies about ingestion through fish, through deer. Um, so yeah, there have been food studies, but not as many as there have been water related ones.
Yeah, I think that the question that Christian had about the fish, I think brings up another question as to whether we actually know what the impact is on wildlife populations. And we may find it within testing of them, but
Hmm.
we don't really have any idea, whether we're seeing, do we anyway, uh, any serious illnesses or organs or other issues that might be related to their being contaminated by PFAS.
It actually depends on the animal or plant actually too, and it depends on the species. And some have been studied more than others. Fish have incurred a lot of impacts, and also they very they really uptake a lot of PFAS and pass it to the human consumer as well, like in the food chain, and there's been so many no fish warnings like in various places, and also deer uptake the a lot. So there's been like no hunting warnings in areas in Maine as well now, because a lot of people like to eat deer. But yeah, there's so many things that have not yet been well studied. Birds uptake a lot of PFAS, for example, but but there's only like a few studies, seeming like they're not actually as affected by the PFAS. Like they uptake a lot of it, but it's not shortening the bird's life. Yeah, a lot of the stuff is truly just emerging, even though these have been around for
Yeah, I
decades.
wonder if it's related to longevity, normal longevity of the species, and whether it has
That
time.
could be.
Yeah.
Yeah, that could be.
I think this is going to need to be our last question. This is Natalie. Do you believe that PFAS could be a potential danger or target for higher level attacks like biological terrorism, warfare? Does this have the potential to become a weapon used against us? After hearing about PFAS, it does not seem far off that this could be a future concern. Interesting.
Yeah, that is really interesting. I wouldn't think so because of how it like gradually like bioaccumulates, but I mean, you never know. I don't know. Do you
Well,
have thoughts on that one?
no, I don't have a lot of thoughts on that, but I can just imagine that rather than being a bioterrorism, I could see it being something that's deemed illegal in part of the world, the well-developed part of the world, and then it just being shifted to other parts of the world and inflicted on them until they get around
Yeah.
to making it illegal, kind
Well,
of like DDT.
Well, honestly, no, that's true, but also that's honestly sort of what's happening in this country right now as well, because with the federal uncertainty, it's really been up to the states to have various types of legislation and regulation regarding PFAS. So a state like Alabama has nothing, but maybe Georgia has a little bit more. But Georgia also produced a lot of PFAS, so I'm just using those two as an example,
Yeah,
and then the PFAS from Georgia is flowing down Alabama's Coosa River, and this is not covered in my book. This is something else, but then Alabama doesn't have any regulation to deal with it. So yeah, these things cross
yeah.
borders. That is true.
Yeah, and I would say, you were talking about how 3M in Alabama, nobody's going to go against 3M. It's a big industry. It's an important funder for the state. Same thing in Maine with pulp mills. I grew up with with piles of pulp mills around. And when I was a youngster in undergraduate school, we were doing water surveys outside of pulp mills on the waterways and looking at how incredibly dangerous the material was that they were pumping into the rivers and from
Yeah.
which communities were pulling their water.
Mhm.
And it took a long time to get any controls on that.
Yeah, that's
When
true.
that's a driving industry for a community or for an entire state. Do you have any last words, Sharon?
No, I just really am glad you all joined me, and I hope it's not all gloomy because I tried to end with some solutions, and there are scientists out there really researching this, but ultimately, the only thing is that it is going to be enough is if consumers are making choices with their wallets and deciding not to encourage spending on products that do contain huge amounts of PFAS. So,
Well, thank you so much, Sharon. This has been a great presentation. I wish you the best with the rest of your tour through the South.
thank you.
And I hope that the sales of the book goes through the roof. Please,
Thank you.
people, go ahead and contact Island Press. You can get that 20% discount. Just use the code POISONED.
Yeah.
Thank
Thank you
you,
so much.
everybody.
Yeah.
Have a great night.
You too.